Book 2, Chapter 7, Escape. Joe knew that David was new, that he was built to be young, and his mind had been intentionally limited by his creators, that his logical processing had been stunted so he would remain an eternal innocent, unable to discern the complexity of the maze in which Orga had them trapped. He knew that David didn't see this blue fairy for what it really was. Another Orga deception. A lie. Joe's mind grew increasingly angered at these things as he watched the boy leave in his determined little strut. He didn't know it was anger inside him. He wasn't supposed to think such things. He had not been programmed for them. "David!" Joe yelled, chasing the boy through the door. But David did not stop. He walked into the crowd and was getting lost in the throng as Joe pursued him. David had no idea what he was going to do. Joe had brought him this far, and when his mind was settled, he'd be thankful for that. But now he had to think of a way to get to Manhattan, the place where the lions weep. What was weep? That was crying, right? Why would the lions cry? He must figure out this puzzle. Then he could find the blue fairy. Then he could go home. He felt a sudden tug on his shoulder, and he turned to see Joe. David's face turned grim as he felt a wave of complex emotions. Another unnoticed advent to Mecha-kind. He liked Joe and felt safe with him, but he could not let Joe dissuade him any longer from his quest. He was about to tell Joe to go away when he noticed the look on the bigger Mecha's face. Joe was gazing dumbfounded over his head. David followed his gaze and saw the amphibicopter parked in the middle of the square. It was the real version of the toy that Martin had tried to make him destroy. It had writing and some kind of pattern on its side. David had seen the insignia before, and he'd seen the word on the back of the craft too. Police is what it said. Beside him, Joe had begun to quickly back away. But too late. From the crowd around them erupted a stern-faced group of people, clad in dark uniforms and dark glasses over their eyes. Wordlessly, the team of New Jersey State Troopers descended on the two rogues. The robot that had triggered the identity scan at Rouge City had been verified as the same one that Johnson & Johnson had captured at the Flesh Fair. The criminal intelligence network that questioned the broken man had not understood what caused the ruckus that destroyed his operation. Nor was it their concern. They were after a mecha, a special mecha. They had dispatched a small squad as soon as the signal had come over the wire. Rouge City had many sensitive concerns, and special agreements had been made with its owners and operators. There were no uniformed patrols on the grounds. Private security did most of the policing, and made their presence known only when the prized patrons got out of hand. But this situation was different. This was the jurisdiction of the state police. The team had landed the two amphibicopters in the city after a quick jump from Central and Trenton. They had alighted in the Central Plaza, just outside where the trigger had been activated. No sooner had they sat down and begun to scour the grounds than the rogue had been spotted in the company of another. They had moved in quickly before the two noticed them, and the one they sought was taken completely by surprise. David felt large, strong hands on his shoulders. He was immediately reminded of the muscular men at the Flesh Fair, and had almost gone into alert mode when one of them took off his dark glasses. He was an older man, and looked at David with concern in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Has this one done anything to you?" David was confused, and looked from the policeman to Joe and back a few times. "No, he is my friend," David said finally. Was that what this was all about? What did they think Joe had done to him? The big policeman snorted. "Huh, better pick your friends more carefully, kid," he said. "Where's your parents?" David thought about this. He realized he had to be clever how he answered. Just like Dr. No, he had to choose his words carefully. "I'm going to see my mommy now," he replied. It wasn't really a lie. The big cop eyed the kid skeptically. The brat was too young to be in the plaza. Legally, there was nothing against him being in this main area, but if he should enter one of the casinos or the fun zones... What kind of parent would let their kid roam the plaza by himself, or in the company of an unlicensed prostitute mecha? There was something strange about the kid too, wasn't there? Something about his eyes. The kid didn't seem to... Then the cop realized what it was that bothered him. But that wasn't possible, was it? Why would someone build something like that? And what would it be doing here in Rouge? But he quickly realized that he didn't want to know the answer to those questions. He didn't feel like dealing with that particular paperwork. "Let's go," he said, slipping his glasses back on, and the team left David standing in the crowd as they took Joe away. They had their sim, the special one, the one that had defied its programming and torn its license off to flee. What had driven it to kill the Bevins woman? They'd know when it was shut down and its processor ripped out. Joe watched David over his shoulder as he was led away. The Bevins situation had almost completely slipped his mind. He knew it was his time. As the curious crowd shuffled in, obscuring David from his sight, Joe knew a new kind of pain. It was an undefinable thing, one he'd not experienced before. He wanted to call out to David, to apologize for saying the cruel things in the hall. He'd only wanted to protect him, to keep him safe, because... "You're in trouble. Bad trouble," the state trooper said as he loaded Joe into the back of one of the copters. David watched the police crowd around the big copter in which Joe was being held. He didn't know why they had taken Joe. He'd never asked what Joe was doing in the force with the old rejects, and now it was too late to find out. Then David noticed something, and all thoughts of Joe left his mind. There was another, smaller amphibicopter just across the plaza, away from the cluster of officers gathered around the copter that held Joe. The smaller one was a regular cruiser, designed for just 2 officers, and it was empty. Its canopy was opened. David had an idea. He had been programmed against taking things that did not belong to him. He was designed to be a good boy, but his design parameters were a thing of the past. He approached the copter, unnoticed by the police or what remained of the small crowd that watched him take Joe. He made sure no one was watching. Then he slipped quickly into the craft. It was official policy to keep all unmanned state vehicles on security lockdown at all times. That was the policy. But like most policies, it was only occasionally observed. The police amphibicopter should have been locked down. The onboard system should have been online, connected to the main cyber regulation number. It should have not allowed the little mecha to take a seat, and it should have requested his clearance code and then sounded an alarm when he couldn't produce one. But enough shoulds and a couple of new books might get you a cup of coffee nowadays. When David crawled into the big seat, the computer didn't even notice him. His size and weight confused the machine. David studied the flashing control panel in front of him. There were rows of buttons lit up in flashing colors. The words written on them described things he was not familiar with. There was cruise, and set route, and auto route, and so many others. He was confused by these terms. This was much different from the simulator game that Martin had shown him. Then he saw one he knew. It said, Canopy. He pressed it hopefully. The upraised reinforced glass doors closed behind him, and he and Teddy were locked inside the copter. He saw another button. It said, Amphi Initiate. He pressed it, but only a harsh beep came from the lit-up dashboard. Then he found another Initiate button. He pressed it, and to his surprise and pleasure, the engine began to hum. It was time to go. David placed his hands on the stirrups of the steering bar. He had seen Mommy drive before. He remembered precisely what she had done, and he had played on Martin's simulator. Could this be that different? He pressed his thumbs into the accelerator buttons in the steering bar, and the copter slowly lifted into the air. The officer had been warned about leaving the copter security inactivated, but so had everyone else. The operative assumption was that nobody was stupid enough to try to take a police amphibicopter, right? So that was why his mouth dropped open and he was speechless for that vital moment when he could have warned his fellow officers. He just didn't believe what he was seeing. Someone was inside the copter, and it wasn't one of them. Damn, it was... The kid! He yelled finally, but too late. He ducked as the tail of the cruiser swiped through the air above his head. It would have decapitated him. The crowd screamed and dove to the ground as the tail of the craft spun in a quick circle over their dodging bodies. It was a miracle none of them were hit. "Be careful, David. This is not a toy," Teddy warned as he saw the Orca dodging and running all about. He'd been with David long enough to know that the boy mecha was not going to listen to reason and surrender the craft. But at least he could be cautious in his operation of the vehicle. The police ran out of the range of the gyrating tail and tried to group together. But the copter swung and hit building signs, and knocked over the tables of the pavilions, throwing obstacles in the path of their organization. Then the thing began to swing from side to side, and they knew they were in trouble. They hit the ground again, and reached for their sidearms. Joe heard the commotion in the plaza, but he'd been locked inside a copter with one of the big men. Through the cage door they could see lights flashing as something large passed by. The lights came again, and the policeman opened the door to see what was going on. Then there was a deafening crash, and the world turned violently upside down. David was trying to stabilize the craft. He'd finally stopped the thing from going in circles, and fortunately he could not get dizzy, or his trip would have already been over. He could feel that he'd been over-adjusting, and he thought he'd finally figured it out, when once again the copter had moved quickly sideways. Then they'd hit something. It must have been big, and they'd hit it hard. When the world righted itself, Joe found himself sitting on the ground. He was in the plaza again. Check that! He scanned his surroundings quickly and realized he'd been thrown clear of the copter. The thing was lying on his side just a few meters away from him. Its canopy was smashed open, and the onboard system was complaining loudly about a security breach. Then Joe saw what he'd caught a glimpse of through the caged door. It was the other copter. The thing was moving back and forth quickly just above ground level, as if some lunatic were operating it. Then Joe caught a glimpse of the confused but determined little face at the controls, and he laughed. "Be careful with your aim," the lead officer yelled. If they should hit someone, their careers would essentially be over. The team knelt and took aim at the copter. "Fire on 1, 2. But the man never got a chance to finish. The copter swung across the plaza suddenly, and they all ducked again as the stolen machine smashed into a large metal trash receptacle, dumping its stinking contents on them. David could not get the machine to balance. He was angry and said some of the bad words that Martin had taught him. Then he saw the man running beside the copter. Was it a policeman? He could not let them get him. He had things to do, places to go. Wait, it was Joe. David looked cautiously at his friend who was running beside the copter, trying to avoid being hit by his frantic maneuverings. Was Joe going to be mad at him? That he had tried to leave without him? Would he try and make him stay again? But when Joe looked up and smiled, David smiled back and took his thumbs from the buttons that made the thing go. He hit the canopy button again, and the glass door opened. Joe slid in quickly, and David crawled across the seat to let him take the controls. The computer had been confused at first about the size and weight of the driver, but now someone with a more familiar physicality was sitting at the console. "Destination?" it inquired. "Manhattan," Joe replied, and the copter immediately took over and began to lift into the night sky. David had not known about this feature, though now that he was with Joe again, he was glad that he had not made his escape already. The copter slid into the sky quickly, but it was still difficult to control. David's crashing of the vehicle had caused some disruption in the navigational systems. The ship was having a hard time determining how close things were. In its ascent, it struck one of the gravity-resistant signs that floated above Rouge City, sending a shower of sparks and debris down on the crowd below. This was a coincidental piece of luck for the runaway mecha. In the process of hitting the sign, the tracking device in the tail of the craft had been destroyed. Navigation would be a little rougher, but there would be no communication with this craft anymore, nor could it be traced from Central Dispatch. On the ground beneath them, the state police converged on their fallen copter and called out for assistance. Their damaged craft didn't want to respond to flight commands at the moment. As they rose into the darkness above the night signs of Rouge, Joe stole a quick glance at his young friend. The boy was watching the city recede beneath them. Joe turned back to the controls. David had saved his brain again. He decided that whatever the little mecha wanted to do, he would help him. He would stand beside him until they found that blue fairy, no matter what manner of creature or machine it might turn out to be. David watched as Rouge City quickly shrunk and disappeared beneath a layer of dark clouds. When they reached the appropriate altitude, the craft straightened and set its auto course for Manhattan, the city at the end of the world. He looked warmly at Joe, who was manning the controls. He felt safe again. Joe knew what he was doing. The blue fairy was getting closer all the time, and so was the end of his quest. He held tightly to Teddy and watched the milky line of stars overhead. The infinite eyes of eternity gazed down at them as they flew through the darkness into a new and unpredictable future.